Hello! Today, the Multimedia Museum of the New Chronology is starting a series of podcasts featuring the founders of the New Chronology, academician of the Russian Academy of Sciences and professor at Moscow State University Anatoly Fomenko, and candidate of Physical and Mathematical Sciences and associate professor at Moscow State University Gleb Nosovsky. Visitors to our museum and social media followers have been asking many questions to the authors of the New Chronology. As of today, the majority of questions are related to their expedition to Jerash, which Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky conducted in 2019. That's why we have decided to dedicate our first podcasts to their new book, Phony Jerusalem, which was written based on the results of this expedition. Today, we have Anatoly Fomenko with us. Hello, Anatoly Timofeyevich.
Hello, Svetlana. Thank you for the introduction. I am very pleased to address those who are listening to us today. I hope we can tell you about the very beginning of our chronological research. Let's briefly start with where the real Jerusalem was located. According to our reconstruction, this Jerusalem is Jerash. It is located on the Bosporus Strait, not far from Istanbul. There are many maps, including medieval maps. I am showing a modern map where two remarkable points are marked on the Asian side of the Bosporus. This is Jerash, an old city, an old fortress, believed to date back to the 12th century, and nearby is Mount Beykoz, the highest point on the Asian side of the Bosporus. According to our reconstruction, this is where the Gospel events unfolded. Jerash is the Gospel Jerusalem, and Mount Beykoz is Mount Golgotha, where Jesus Christ was crucified in the year 1185. Today, there is a sanctuary on this mountain worshipped by Muslims. It is called the Sanctuary of Saint Yusha. Yusha, apparently, is one of the names of Jesus. Yusha and Jesus. The sounds sh and s often interchanged with each other. This is a fenced-off area of approximately 17 by 3 meters, and trees grow on this part of the land. According to our reconstruction, this is not the real tomb of Yusha and Jesus. This is the setting, marking the place where Jesus, also known as Andronikos Christ, was crucified. Today, many people come here to worship, but, of course, they worship Yusha, forgetting that we should actually understand that this is the place of Jesus Christ's crucifixion. Here, on the summit of Mount Beykoz, there used to be an old temple. Today, there is a mosque there, a territory for pilgrims who come here, a fence surrounding the crucifixion site. Around this fence, there is a concrete wall. You can see an aerial view, a map of this sanctuary, the temple, the surrounding wall, the place of worship, and the tomb of Jesus. Naturally, this is a pseudo-tomb. Inside the area enclosed by the fence, there are two large stones. Next to one of the stones is a pole with a golden topping. Apparently, it marks the actual place of the crucifixion of Andronikos Christ. The second stone, at the other end of the enclosed area, is the place where the body was laid. Those interested can go to Istanbul, visit this place. It is open to visitors and is very romantic, leaving a profound impression. Old depictions have been preserved, showing the view of Jerusalem, also known as Jerash, and Mount Beykoz. Today, there are small tours available. All of this is located near the entrance to the Black Sea. Directly from the top of Mount Beykoz and from the territory of Jerash, Jerusalem, you can see the exit to the Black Sea, the northern entrance to the Bosporus. On old maps, this place is marked as Mount Heracles, and many legends are associated with this place. Christ was here under various names, including the name Heracles. The center of the world used to be located in Jerusalem. Old three-petal maps have been preserved. You can see one of the maps in the photo. The three petals depict Europe, Asia, and Africa, with Jerusalem at the center. According to our reconstruction, as described in our book, this is indeed Jerash, the Bosporus Strait, which is geographically at the center, where Europe, Asia, and Africa converge. This is briefly about where the real gospel Jerusalem was. Let's move on to the question of why the authentic Jerusalem was forgotten, and new Jerusalems emerged. A significant contribution to the multiplication of Jerusalems was made during the Reformation and the time of troubles, when, according to our reconstruction, the great empire fragmented into separate states. In particular, reformers began rewriting history, seeking to obscure the true picture of Russia Horde. Naturally, this also applied to the authentic Jerusalem of the Gospels, Jerash, Sargrad on the Bosporus. They decided to designate another point on the map as Jerusalem. However, in addition, the emergence of new Jerusalems seems to have been driven by another important consideration. During the era of the empire in the 13th to 16th centuries, holy places associated with Christ and the Holy Family became objects of worship for believers. This is understandable. Christianity had become the state religion of the vast Horde Empire. Many people wanted to worship and traveled to holy places. Numerous pilgrims flocked to the place of Christ's birth, the place of baptism, the place of crucifixion, the place of ascension, the place of burial, the mountain where God gave Moses the stone tablets, and so on. Obviously, soon the rulers of the empire became concerned about the problem that had arisen. The holy places were becoming trampled and destroyed. Thousands of people came here. Many pilgrims wanted to take a handful of soil or a piece of stone from a monument as a souvenir for their worship. In addition, this pilgrimage interfered with the narrow circle of the imperial elite from performing their family rituals, which were not intended for commoners. Furthermore, there was another important consideration. The holy places were scattered across the map of Europe and Asia, far apart from each other. Let me remind you of our reconstruction. Christ's birthplace was at Cape Violent in Crimea. Christ's baptism was in the Bosporus Strait, also referred to as the River Jordan at the time. The crucifixion of Andronikos Christ took place in Jerash Sargrad, which I mentioned earlier, on Mount Beykoz, also known as the Gospel Golgotha. The burial of Christ and the Virgin Mary was initially in Egypt, in Proto-Abu Simbel, and then relocated to a grand mound on Mount Nemrut in southeastern Turkey. The biblical Mount Sinai, also known as Mount Zion, is Mount Vesuvius in Italy, and so on. It is clear that, despite all the desire, a sincere pilgrim could not visit all the authentic holy places of Christianity in a reasonable amount of time, as they were located in different lands and spread over thousands of kilometers. Thus, the rulers of the empire were faced with the need to separate the sacred mysteries performed by the elite, that is, for themselves, from the mass worship of pilgrim crowds. They found a solution. They decided to create compact models, props, so to speak, where all the main models of holy places would be presented in a limited space. And they decided to hide the authentic holy places, the originals, the primary sources, from the public eye and protect them from prying eyes. In doing so, they achieved several objectives. Firstly, they separated places of worship for the few nobles from the new places of worship for the common people. Secondly, at the created exhibitions, numerous replicas of all the holy places were assembled on a relatively small territory. This significantly facilitated the process of worship for pilgrims. Pilgrims traveled from afar, overcoming many obstacles to reach Jerusalem. For example, they sailed on ships from England to the territory of present-day Jordan. Then, when they arrived in the New Jerusalem, they could visit almost all the major holy imitations. Here, the tour guides confidently told him, is the cave of Christ's birth. Over there, not far, the place of baptism. To the right is Mount Golgotha. And there, a few kilometers away, the famous Mount Zion or Sinai. And so on. It was a very reasonable idea, and it was put into practice. The first such New Jerusalem was created in Jerash. It is a temple complex located in present-day Jordan. In reality, Jerash is a slightly distorted name of Jerash. It was a grand complex of temples, alleys, buildings, and colonnades. It was actually built in the 13th century as a sanctuary of the royal Christianity at that time. Later, it apparently became a memorial site where the sarcophagi with the mummies of Christ and the Virgin Mary rested temporarily when they were transferred from Egypt, from Proto-Abu Simbel to southeastern Turkey, to a mound on Mount Nemrut. Then, Jerash was transformed into an exhibition model of Jerusalem. This was, so to speak, the first New Jerusalem. It was located in the Ottoman Empire and was under the control of the sultans. This set complex, the new exhibition Jerusalem, operated until the mid-17th century when Sultan Murad IV changed the religion in the state. He essentially abolished the previous ancient Orthodox Christianity and introduced what is now called Islam. Clearly, after such a serious religious reform, Jerash, the fake Jerusalem, lost its significance as a place of worship for Christians and was abandoned. It was covered with sand, and after some time, in the 17th or 18th century, a powerful mudslide swept over it, destroying many temples and covering the main part of the ancient city with multi-meter deposits. In this state, forgotten Jerash stood until the beginning of the 20th century when it finally began to be excavated. Now, let's take a look at what Jerash looks like. Here is Sultan Murad IV. This is a photograph of the thick layer of deposits that covered the first New Jerusalem Jerash. It was buried under a layer of earth. The huge amphitheaters of Jerash were completely covered with sediment. Today, a part of them has been excavated. It can be seen how deep they are today in the ground under a huge mass of deposits. Currently, only a portion of Jerash has been excavated. When visitors come to Jerash, they see the excavated part on this map. It is a vast area, but an even larger area remains unexcavated, hidden under the later houses and settlements of local residents. The excavated part is impressive. These are huge complexes, extensive colonnades stretching for kilometers. Today, very few of these columns remain, but even what remains makes a tremendous impression. You can take a look at our journey through Jerash. We were there in 2019, carefully examined the entire complex, drew conclusions, compared it with the description in the Russian Chronicle, and based on that, this book, we are presenting today, was born. In the photo, you can see an aerial view of one of the main squares of Jerash. Today, there are many pilgrims from various countries here. The gates, the entrance to Jerash, are still standing. You can see it today. You can go to Jordan and explore this wonderful place. Now, let's go back to the 17th century. As we mentioned, Jerash was abandoned, then covered with sediment, and was firmly forgotten. However, the idea of the New Jerusalem was certainly not forgotten. The idea of an exhibition for pilgrims seemed very fruitful and the good idea to the rulers. The new rulers of Russia, the Romanovs, could not afford to lose a place of worship for the people. During the time of the empire, before the Romanovs, many pilgrims visited distant Jerash in Jordan and left their money there. But now they needed a new venue. It was then that the decision to create Jerusalem near Moscow was made by the Romanovs. The idea was implemented, and the famous New Jerusalem of Patriarch Nikon was built. Near Moscow, not far from Zvenigorat, a grand construction project was started. It was not just a new Jerusalem but simply Jerusalem that was envisioned here. Local settlements and rivers were renamed. For example, the hill near Zvenigorat was named Zion. A male monastery was founded here. Palestinian names were drawn on the map here. The hill to the east of the monastery, for example, was named Elion. A small convent founded by Nikon was named Bethany. There was a hill that was named Tabor. The village of Mikulina was renamed Transfiguration, and the village of Zinovievo Pustosh was named Capernaum. The Istra River was renamed the Jordan. A lot was done here. It was a major state program, and it was implemented very widely. If it had been fully implemented, then, of course, after some time, everyone would have believed that Jerusalem was located on the Istra River near Moscow. No one would remember that in the 17th century, this river was still called the Istra. Everyone would call it the Gospel River Jordan. Guides would have been written that would convincingly tell that it was here that the chronicle history of Jerusalem unfolded. They would show the very Mount Sinai, which Moses climbed. And if someone announced loudly that the village of Capernaum in the 17th century was called Zinovievo Pustosh, well, of course, such a person would be regarded with the same suspicion as someone today who tries to restore the former Arabic names in modern Palestine. For example, the Arabic name of Al-Quds for modern Jerusalem in Palestine, or the Arabic name of a village, not long ago renamed as biblical Jericho. However, the Romanovs soon halted the construction of the New Jerusalem near Moscow. The project was cancelled. The reasons for this were not publicly discussed, and construction was slowed down. After that, the Romanovs began to call this territory the New Jerusalem. They said, it was a new, not the real Jerusalem. And in general, the entire grand plan was supposedly a personal whim of Patriarch Nikon. The real Jerusalem was located elsewhere, allegedly in modern Palestine, where modern Jerusalem is located today. But why was this done? It appears that it was decided that the Romanovs, as the new rulers of Russia, are unworthy of such a sacred place as Jerusalem. And so, Nikon's project was rolled back. It was decided to build a sham Jerusalem in another place. The real Jerusalem on the Bosporus was forgotten. This information remained only for a narrow circle of insiders. After the Romanovs were denied the creation of Jerusalem, it was decided to restore it in the Middle East. They took advantage of the ongoing war between Europe and the Ottoman Empire, the future Turkey. This was during Napoleon's famous campaign in Egypt and the Middle East. Obviously, in addition to military victories, it would have been very useful for Napoleon to find Jerusalem. At that time, there was probably still information that Jerusalem was somewhere in the Middle East. It was forgotten that this was an imitation of Jerusalem. It was decided to find it. In particular, this was probably one of the goals of Napoleon's campaign when his troops entered the Middle East. But Napoleon did not find the genuine New Jerusalem Jerash, the first fake Jerusalem in Jordan. They stopped at a location about 100 kilometers away, near a small Arab settlement called Al-Quds. It's hard to say why. Maybe it was due to haste. After all, it was a war with military difficulties. They didn't find the first fake Jerusalem and decided to stop nearby, approximately 100 kilometers away. The settlement of Al-Quds was designated as the new fake Jerusalem. After that, routine work began. In these places, they hastily began to discover the so-called Jerusalem sanctuaries. The work boiled over. Historians began to fervently and sincerely argue that these places were indeed described in the Gospels and the Old Testament. Today, they show us the holy sites in modern Jerusalem. The main sanctuary is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It is believed to have been established a long time ago, even in the 4th century. However, at the same time, it is known that it was repeatedly destroyed and completely demolished. The existing church that you will see when you visit Palestinian Jerusalem was rebuilt in 1810. This is the early 19th century. So, very late. Other sanctuaries that were supposedly here earlier and were destroyed by preceding invasions, wars, fires, and disasters were also restored very late. All of this happened in the late 18th to early 19th century. Regarding Golgotha,
Anatoly Timofeyevich, I apologize for interrupting. Regarding the Holy Sepulchre in modern Jerusalem, the main argument put forth by proponents of the version that Jerusalem in Israel is the genuine Jerusalem, is the annual miracle of the holy fire at the Lord's tomb. In other words, they claim that if the new chronology described the events accurately, then the holy fire would not descend. What can you say about this?
we have a dedicated study on this fire. We will address it separately. We will explain when and why this custom, which is highly revered today, originated. In our book, we show that this custom and its modern interpretation do not in any way prove that the Palestinian Jerusalem is the genuine Gospel Jerusalem. This is a separate and very interesting subject that we will certainly discuss. Regarding the argument that Palestinian Jerusalem is the genuine holy place, there is another point raised. In 2016, they did decide to conduct excavations and open the tomb of the Lord. This was done. However, everything they found appears quite meager. They discovered a pile of stones and dust. When they removed it, they found a limestone shelf on which, we are told, the body of Christ lay. They also found a marble slab. That's all they found. Therefore, today, we cannot speak of any serious evidence. I repeat, we have a separate study on this topic. It can be found in our books, especially in our book, Biblical Russia. There, we analyze in detail in which years, why, and how the Arab settlement of Al-Quds was declared the Gospel Jerusalem. Regarding Golgotha, I'd like to say a few words. Nowadays, a chapel is presented as Golgotha. Here are modern photographs showing the sectional drawing of the structures in modern Jerusalem. There is the Lord's tomb. As it is believed, this is the Gospel Golgotha. All of this was constructed in the early 19th century and even later. Now, let's return to Jerash in Jordan. Our book extensively discusses what you can see in Jerash today. Gleb Nasovsky will have a separate narration discussing the correspondence between the description in the Russian Chronicle, the description of the 16th century pilgrimage, and the pilgrimage specifically to Jerash. This description fits perfectly with what we see in Jerash today. Now, in conclusion of our story, I'd like to share a narrative about the mosaic map that was discovered in Medaba, Jordan, in the late 19th century, known as the Medaba mosaic map. This map depicts Jerusalem and its surrounding lands. What is this map? The town of Medaba is located in the northwestern part of Jordan, 30 kilometers south of the capital, Amman. It is there, on the floor of the Orthodox Church of St. George, as shown in the photograph, that the mosaic map was discovered. Although it has survived partially, it contains a wealth of information. Historians believe it to be the oldest map of the Holy Land, and we agree with this assessment. It is indeed the oldest depiction of the Holy Land. The map was excavated in the late 19th century, and it is believed that the mosaic was created during the time of Justinian I. What makes it remarkable? The center of the map features an image of Jerusalem. Furthermore, the name of the city is written in plain text on the map. There is a large inscription in the mosaic, written in red. It reads, Hagia Polis Jerusa, with the end of the word being damaged. It is simply written, Hagia is holy, Polis is city, and Jerusa is Jerusalem. The last three letters, lim, were knocked down, and there are no tiles in this place. In other words, it plainly states that this map shows the holy city of Jerusalem. Historians say this, and in this case, we fully agree with them. Archaeologists correctly identified the main city depicted in the center of the Madaba mosaic as Jerusalem of the Holy Land. Let's take a look at the map. Naturally, this map is presented in books and on the internet today. Many different images of it can be found. We visited this church, and the map was open for us to see. We thoroughly and meticulously photographed it in its entirety, along with all its fragments. In the center, you can see a portion of the mosaic that depicts Jerusalem in great detail, showing its layout, alleys, colonnades along the sides of the alleys, and the main temples, which are depicted very intricately and are easily recognizable. I will immediately inform you of a very important conclusion we have made. It is asserted that this map perfectly corresponds to the map of Jerash in Jordan, which is the first false Jerusalem. Comparing this map with what you can see in Jerash today demonstrates that it is indeed the same place, the same city. It was the first pretended Jerusalem. A second assertion is that this Madaba map does not correspond at all to today's Jerusalem in Palestine. There is no resemblance whatsoever. The map of Jerusalem, both the modern one and the map of the Old Jerusalem made in the 19th century, bears no resemblance to the Madaba map. Therefore, this remarkable map indeed contains evidence that Jerash is the first new Jerusalem created after the genuine Jerusalem, the Gospel Jerash on the Asian coast of the Bosporus, was plunged into oblivion and left as a holy place only for the initiated, while a new Jerusalem Jerash was made for the people, for ordinary folks. With this, I will conclude the first part of our presentation about our book titled, Phony Jerusalem. In the second part, Gleb Nasovsky will talk about what we saw in Jerash, its correspondence with the description in the Russian Chronicle. Thank you for your attention.
Hello. Today, we continue our conversation about the expedition of Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nasovsky to Jerash, which they extensively described in their new book, Phony Jerusalem. Today, we have Gleb Nasovsky with us. Hello, Gleb Vladimirovich.
Hello. It's very nice to be here.
Gleb Vladimirovich, your joint scientific expedition with Anatoly Fomenko to Jerash took place after your acquaintance with the Russian chronicler. a unique historical document that includes descriptions of the pilgrimage to Jerusalem in the 16th century. Please tell us how the description of Jerusalem in the Russian chronicler corresponds to what you saw in Jerash.
Yes, indeed, a very good question. I am holding in my hands a copy of the Russian chronicler. It was discovered a few years ago in a private library. It was published by the Ukteon Publishing House. I will open it and show you a page from this edition. Approximately half of this volume is dedicated to the World Chronicle. And somewhere in the middle, the chronicle related to Russia begins, describing Russian history in great detail. Interestingly, many pages of this chronicle are devoted to events that are completely forgotten and absent in the version of Russian history that we are accustomed to. This invaluable source was written in 1649, and fortunately, we found it. By the way, later we discovered that several copies of it are stored in some closed repositories, studied by historians, but it has never been published by the specialists who were supposed to publish it earlier. So, in this chronicle, there is a section dedicated to the journey to Jerusalem during the reign of Ivan the Terrible. This journey is described in great detail. The Russian cities are mentioned through which the route from Moscow passed, how they set out to sea, how they sailed, how they arrived in Jaffa, and there the path split. The author speaks of two possible routes. One route goes overland through Damascus, but they did not take that route. The second route went through Jaffa. Jaffa is the modern city of Tel Aviv. It was called Jaffa back then, and the chronicle mentions the name Jaffa. Therefore, the pilgrims arrived in Jaffa, disembarked, and then continued eastward toward Jerusalem as a caravan. There was a certain town called Ramah on the way. The journey is described in quite some detail, but how many days did they travel from Jaffa to Ramah? First, they went to Ramah, and then from Ramah to Jerusalem. Now I will share my screen. Here, it is marked. This is a modern map, so it says Tel Aviv instead of Jaffa, although it is written as Jaffa at the bottom, as you can see, in English. Tel Aviv is the same as Jaffa. They disembarked from ships in Jaffa. Then they gathered their belongings, rode on donkeys, and headed east. How many days? In the chronicle, it says, day, but this expression, day, caught our attention. It looked somewhat unusual in this chronicle because in all other places where it mentioned 1 day of travel, it explicitly stated that it was 1 day. But here, it simply said, day. This caught our attention. At first, we didn't pay much attention, but it was still something peculiar. It left the impression that it might be 1 day, or it might be several days. It seemed like there might be a missing number here. We took note of this and continued reading. So, it was described how the pilgrims walked either 1 day or several days to the east to a certain town called Ramah. Then, from this town of Ramah, they proceeded to Jerusalem, passing through rocky mountains, and it was specified how much time it took them to pass through these rocky mountains before arriving in Jerusalem. We looked at the map, and we asked ourselves where exactly to the east of Jaffa there was a town called Ramah, which was about a day's journey away. 5 kilometers and 1 day of travel. They needed to walk between these rocky mountains to reach a certain Jerusalem. In reality, to the east of Tel Aviv, there is only one major city, and Ramah is described as a major city. If we do not consider various villages, this city is the only one, which is today known as Amman. As we can see, it is written here in Arabic with an ain. The first letter is an Arabic ain, which sometimes, when translated into Russian, becomes a buri r. Therefore, this Arabic name can be transliterated into Russian as either Amman or Raman. The first R should be pronounced buri, and then it becomes Raman. We knew examples where the Arabic ain can become R in pronunciation. In the name Amman, the Arabic ending an is often omitted, which is why this city can sound like Amma or Rama. This immediately caught our attention, especially since it was the only major city to the east of Jaffa, and the name fit perfectly with Rama. Then, we continued to read in the Russian chronicler the detailed description of how the pilgrims walked from Ramah to Jerusalem. And this route was described unequivocally. We mapped out this route, and what did we come across? We came across a city called Jerash. Again, Jerash or Gerasa is Jerusalem. Yeras and Giras and Jerash. J is sometimes pronounced as Ya. These are issues of Arabic pronunciation. There are pronunciations with sounds J and with Ya. G can also be pronounced as Gay, as they do in Egypt. It can be pronounced as Ya. So, Jerash also could be Yaras and J as S. Yaras aligns perfectly with the name of Jerusalem. This incredible coincidence strongly attracted our attention. We packed off and specifically went to these places to see with our own eyes what was there. I want to tell you about what we saw there. I will show various maps and our photographs. This is the route from Ramah Amman to Jerash, Jerusalem. It indeed passes through rocky mountains. Here on the map, it is shown in more detail how to go from Ramah to Jerusalem. Everything is measured in both steps and hours, and it precisely matches what the chronicle describes. Let's take a close look at this map. It shows what the pilgrim actually described and what European explorers found when they ventured into these areas in the 19th century, trying to find Jerusalem based on similar descriptions. They also read that the pilgrims disembarked in Jaffa and then continued eastward. And in fact, those who were searching for Jerusalem had to travel the same way. They had to first reach Ramah, which is also Amman, and then proceed northeast to Jerash. What did they do? In the 19th century, when they were searching for it, Jerash was covered by a mud flow and buried under a 4-meter layer of soil. There wasn't much sticking out there, and they did not find it. So, they stopped too early. They covered only about one-third of the distance and turned in that direction. They found some mountains, passed through them, and found the village of Al-Quds. They believed it was the best match for the descriptions. Of course, they did not find any Ramah, and they later named some Arab village Ramah. They interpreted the name Al-Quds as holy in Arabic. They renamed it to Jerusalem and said, well, it fits. Jerusalem is a holy city. Al-Quds means holy, so this must be Jerusalem. They also allegedly found here the other names mentioned in the sources. In other words, they simply renamed Arab villages to match the required names, and traces of their search efforts are visible. They ended up with two Ramahs. One is called Ramlah, and there is another one here. So, they indeed searched and tried to map everything. They just didn't go far enough. They needed to go approximately 2 to 3 times farther. In the 20th century, Jerash was excavated. It is still not fully excavated. And here is a panorama from one of the high points. When we visited there, we understood the oddity that had always caught our attention in pilgrimage descriptions of Jerusalem. The strange thing is that famous places like David's house, the prison of Christ, Golgotha, the place where John the Baptist was imprisoned, and many Old and New Testament sites, all of them were at distances of tens, or at most hundreds of steps from each other. It seemed like the pilgrim was walking on a patch of land and saw all the Old and New Testament sanctuaries there. This could not have been possible, of course, but that's how it was written, and it always amazed us. And here, we understood what was going on. It turns out that the pilgrims didn't travel to the real Jerusalem. From the very beginning, this Jerusalem was for show. More precisely, it was an ancient Roman sanctuary from the time of the royal Christianity, according to the new chronology, which was destroyed by the Ottomans when they conquered these areas in the early 16th century. Shortly after that, they converted one of these ruined Roman sanctuaries into a fake Jerusalem. At that time, the Ottomans were still Christians, and they came up with the idea of creating such an exhibition. Essentially, they created religious tourism. Instead of taking people to places that were hundreds of kilometers apart, which was difficult, especially given the means of transportation at the time, they created a place where there were replicas of all Old and New Testament sanctuaries on a patch of land. They fenced off this area and brought pilgrims from around the world there for money. By doing this, they strengthened religious feelings, and it had to be strengthened in those days because it was shortly after the failed end of the world, which everyone had been promised in 1492, also known as the 7,000th year from Adam. It didn't happen, and there was a significant upheaval in people's minds. Faith in the church and those in power, who said one thing but another happened, was significantly shaken. Therefore, there was an ideological necessity to support people's faith. There may have been other considerations, but this brilliant idea, ahead of its time, to create international tourism, especially religious tourism, came to the minds of the imperial authorities, primarily those in Istanbul because they controlled these areas at the time, and to create there a prop version of Jerusalem. The Turks were there, collecting money, as is written in all the pilgrim accounts. Thus, once again, this city was an old Roman sanctuary adapted for an imitation of Jerusalem. This is an overview of what has been excavated. On the left, I'm pointing with my mouse. These hills have not yet been excavated. There were some structures there as well, but they are all buried under the mud flow. There was an earthquake, and underground water came out from the mountain, bringing streams of mud and stones that covered the city. On the right, all of this was excavated in the 20th century.
We will continue our conversation with Gleb Nasovsky about the expedition to Jerash next Sunday, December 20th. See you in a week. Hello. Today we continue our conversation with Gleb Nasovsky about their joint expedition with Anatoly Fomenko to Jerash and the matching of this ancient city to the description of Jerusalem in the Russian chronicler. Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nasovsky have detailed their expedition in their new book, Phony Jerusalem. Gleb Vladimirovich, hello.
Hello, nice to meet you again.
Last time you said that Jerusalem, described in the Russian chronicler, was Jerash. Please tell us now about what you saw inside the city following the pilgrimage route of the 16th century.
We are returning to Jerash and entering through the north gate, just as the pilgrim describes. By the way, why did they start from the north gate? Why were pilgrims admitted through the north gate? Because this high hill, where they arranged the New Testament part of the prop version of Jerusalem, and everything related to the New Testament, is precisely located near the north gate. The idea was that a pilgrim first would examine all that was related to the New Testament, considering it the most important, and then proceed to the south gate, where the Old Testament, secondary in relation to the New Testament, was located. That's why they arranged it this way. Today, tourists enter the opposite way. This is the ascent to the Church of the Resurrection. The north gate is on our left. In the distance is the modern city built beyond this ancient sanctuary transformed into the fake Jerusalem. The ascent is very steep, which is why they chose it as Golgotha, as a high mountain on which Christ ascended with the cross on his shoulders. The entering pilgrim would first climb this high staircase and feel like he was on the path of Christ ascending Golgotha. After that, he entered this space. Here, the map is shown. This space, measuring 90 by 126 meters, is actually surrounded by rows of columns. The pilgrim provides the dimensions of the Church of the Resurrection in Russian sajans. If we convert sajans into meters, it becomes exactly 90 by 126 meters. These dimensions are precisely indicated in the Russian chronicler. I want to tell you about what we saw there. I will show various maps and our photos. When you read about it, you might wonder how can there be a church of such size. Imagine, 90 by 126 meters. This is a huge space. Today, with the help of concrete structures, such a building can be constructed. In those times, churches were domed, and building such a structure was impossible. In this great church of the resurrection, inside there was another church. That's how he describes it. So, inside one church, there was another church. In present-day Jerusalem, they tried to recreate this, but it turned out awkward. They have Golgotha inside the church and some church inside another church. They tried to recreate it. And it's evident that they tried to understand it without realizing what was actually described. The great church of the resurrection was described as a rectangular enclosed area. It was called the Great Church. And inside this enclosed area was Golgotha. Inside the great church of the resurrection, there is a mountain. If someone has been to Israel or seen some photos, there's actually a mountain right inside the church. Inside this church of the resurrection, there is a small hill, which is Golgotha. That's what was actually meant. In the church of the resurrection, there is an enclosed area, and inside, there is a mountain. That's the mountain. This is what it really looked like. Inside the great church of the resurrection, there was another elevated church. This was actually Golgotha. The number of steps was counted by the pilgrim. It's exactly as it is here. Entering this Golgotha, which was transformed from an ancient Roman temple, the pilgrim saw the Lord's sepulchre. This is the view of Golgotha inside the church from the other side. These are the remnants of columns surrounding the perimeter of the rectangular great church of the resurrection. And this elevated structure is Golgotha inside the great church. This is a photo from the outside. We are standing outside the great church of the resurrection, outside the rectangular perimeter surrounded by a fairly dense row of columns. They have not been fully preserved on all sides. They have been well preserved on this side, but on the other side, there aren't as many. But you can still see that they were all there. This is a view of Golgotha from outside the great church of the resurrection. These are the very steps to Golgotha, which are also described by the pilgrim, including their quantity. These are the same steps, from the other side. As the pilgrim ascended these steps, he reached a platform from which he had to climb a few more steps, and then he arrived at the place of the Holy Sepulchre. Look at how it was designed. This is Golgotha from another side. I will talk more about this later. We are returning to the Holy Sepulchre. As the pilgrim ascended Golgotha, he saw the Lord's sepulchre. The Lord's sepulchre was attached to the right side of the wall. The Lord's sepulchre was here. It was a certain stone structure. These are the remnants of what was there. It was like a small chapel, on the right side, in the corner. Inside this chapel was the Lord's sepulchre itself. The pilgrim writes it like this: the Lord's sepulchre was made of marble. It was not real. Queen Helena placed it there, and the real Lord's sepulchre was downstairs. Look, there is space beneath this floor. A little bit later I will show you the so-called real Lord's sepulchre, which was located below, beneath this stone Lord's sepulchre. People gathered here, the patriarch walked here, and there was the miracle of the descent of the holy fire. Once again, this is the place where the remnants of the Lord's sepulchre were. On the other side, there was a place where the cross stood. The actual cross was no longer there, but there was a recess for the cross. This is the drawing. Here on the drawing, you can see that beneath the floor, where the Lord's sepulchre stood, there was an internal space enclosed on all sides. And, as the pilgrim writes, it was bricked up. You couldn't enter there. All the doors were tightly closed. In reality, there was a hidden door, of course. But they didn't show it to the pilgrims. so that they would not request to look at the real Holy Sepulchre. They were told that it was all closed.
Gleb Vladimirovich, did the pilgrims who went to Jerash know that they were going to see a replica of Jerusalem?
Of course not. They were convinced that they were going to see the true Jerusalem. Here is that hidden door that leads there, which the pilgrims were not shown. They thought it didn't exist. And this is the hole, punctured into the underground chamber. Archaeologists have punctured it and surrounded it with stones so that no one would fall in. They did it themselves. This is the so-called real Holy Sepulchre. It was found not very far from this place, and it's made of lead, with the same ropes and seals that the Jews placed, if you remember the Gospel. Here is the plaque. These are not real ropes. They are depicted. They are embossed, cast in lead. And these seals with which the Jews sealed the Lord's sepulchre are depicted here. So, this is the Lord's sepulchre, as if real, made of lead, which was not shown to the pilgrims. It was beneath the stone one, and the pilgrims were told that it was there. Here is where the miracle of the holy fire took place. What was it? Archaeologists have assembled the remains. The mud flow destroyed everything. It was all buried in mud and stones, up to 4 meters high. Many columns were knocked down. Everything was destroyed. Later, archaeologists excavated and somehow assembled it, and they saw that something was here. They later assembled it. It should be understood that local residents also used a lot of these stones for construction. The city was largely built from these stones. There was a stone chapel here, and inside was the Holy Sepulchre. The pilgrim describes in detail how a standing crowd waited while the patriarch circled around, recited prayers, and waited. And here was the cross. You see, there's no roof over it, just open sky. The descent of the holy fire did not occur at midnight, as it does today, but at noon, close to noon. The sign that the fire would descend was when the sun began to shine on a certain cross that was specially placed here. As soon as they saw the sun reflecting off this cross, it was a sign that the descent of the holy fire would occur. If the sun did not reflect off the cross, it meant there would be no holy fire. There must have been various circumstances, I suppose. There were years when the sky was overcast, and the sun did not reflect off the cross. So, then, everyone had to understand that if it didn't reflect, there would be no holy fire. If it did reflect, if the day was clear, and the sun shone on the cross, it meant there would be the holy fire. The pilgrim describes all of this. Everything was precisely timed. After the sun began to shine on this cross, a specific number of prayers were recited, and a specific number of words were spoken. The patriarch took a bundle of candles in his hands and simply touched them to the marble lid of the sepulchre. Everything here was faced with marble. This is how it is described. So, what we see today is, first of all, in ruins, and secondly, all the marble has been removed and used for some construction or local residents' household needs. All of this was splendidly decorated and beautifully faced with marble. When the rays began to shine on the marble lid of the sepulchre, it would start to shimmer, and, in full view of everyone, they would bring candles to it, unlike today. Today, the patriarch goes somewhere and comes out with lit candles. But here, right in front of everyone, He would bring candles to the sepulchre's lid, and the candles would ignite. This was the holy fire. This was in the late 16th century. It was precisely during this time that a magnifying glass was invented, which could be used to ignite something. It was a new scientific method of obtaining fire. Few people knew about it at the time. It was an invention of only a few years. And it was used for such a miracle that attracted a huge number of pilgrims. Simply put, there was a magnifying glass on top, which people didn't notice, or even if they did notice, they paid no attention to it. Who cared if there was some glass up there? Probably just a window. Because nobody knew what a magnifying glass was at that time, what properties it had that allowed it to ignite things. When the sun rose in such a way that its rays focused on the lid of the sepulchre, candles were immediately brought there, and they naturally ignited. I want to say that it was a very clever and scientific miracle. It was done right on the cutting edge of the science of that time. It was done very well and made a huge impression on believers. Now, let's go through the photos once again. This is the so-called real sepulchre. It was found not far from this place and it is now on display in a museum. These are various structures next to Golgotha, and the pilgrim describes them. The place where the crown of thorns was woven, the place where they did this and that, the navel of the world, many different sacred places. They were all within a few steps of Golgotha and they stuck all over it. There are remnants of all of this. This is a round church, which he describes as the navel of the world. Here it is, and some column fragment sticks out. And here is the entrance down to some cave, which they believed led to the underworld. They explained to them that from here, you could descend into the hell, and this was the navel of the world. Again, I emphasize that it did not look exactly like this. It was all beautiful, faced with marble, and everything was very, very luxurious. This is from another angle. Here, next to Golgotha, there was a certain ancient Roman cistern, a place for storing water. They turned it into an underground prison where Christ was in before the crucifixion. He was supposedly held here in this underground cave, next to Golgotha. There was no water in it anymore. He was kept here, then he was taken out and taken to Golgotha. That's exactly how it's all described. Of course, the pilgrim's description is somewhat incredible because it's just some kind of underground dungeon, just a few steps away from Golgotha. Obviously, the distances indicated by the pilgrim seem improbable. But in reality, it was all like that. Just a few steps from the prison, there was Golgotha. Everything was as the pilgrim described. And next to it lies this column. I showed it to you. It fell. The mud flow knocked it down, but it's a tall column. It's the column to which Christ was tied when he was flogged. All of this is described there. Next to the prison, there stood a column. This is Christ carrying the cross. How is it depicted? This is the column, a huge pillar. It fell, but it's still there. And here is the entrance to the prison. This is exactly how everything is described. There was also a stone block nearby, where Christ's feet were shackled. There is indeed some stone with a hole. Possibly, that's the same column. This is an overall diagram of Jerash. These are the north gates, where the pilgrim entered as described. He came in here, climbed steeply up to the Church of the Resurrection, to Golgotha, and explored everything. Then he went towards the underground church of Constantine and Helena, where the true cross was recovered. And then he went on to the Old Testament part, to the house of King David, to the house of Joachim and Anna, to the grotto of the Annunciation, to the Holy of Holies. I'll also tell you about that. But first, the New Testament part. After Golgotha, he went here, to the church of Constantine and Helena. What is the church of Constantine and Helena? We were in New Jerusalem. They tried to do something about this. It's an underground church built at the place where Helena, through excavations, found the very cross on which Christ was crucified. There's a staircase leading down into what looks like an underground vault. This is where the Lord's true cross was discovered. They did this very cleverly. Next to the Church of the Resurrection, they found an ancient Roman theater. It was situated on a slope. How was this all built? There were many doors. You see, many doors. That's how the pilgrim describes it. We approach and see many doors. We enter any of them. You see, it is on a slope. They came in here, and there were many doors. Then they descended these steps. The number of steps is precisely indicated, and it matches exactly what the pilgrim says. There were exactly that many steps. Then we keep going. And we see another recess where the true cross was recovered. These are the doors. The pilgrim approached from the Church of the Resurrection. Here he came in. He descended these steps. These are the steps. He could enter any door and descend the steps. There were exactly 30 of these steps. The pilgrim writes about it. Well, next. This is an old photo. The pilgrim approached from the Church of the Resurrection. He entered any door, descended 30 steps, arrived here. Then, after going a bit further, he had to enter another recess, which had 7 steps. And there, at the depth, was the place where Helena found the Lord's true cross. Indeed, you see, there's a dugout pit here. It's not meant for anything else, and it has 7 steps leading down. This is still like this today. Of course, they've added this. The theater is an old structure that they adapted. But here, they specifically excavated the pit. You see, they said, we'll go here, descend another 7 steps, and here will be the very place where the true cross was recovered. All of this matches the pilgrim's descriptions exactly.
We will continue our conversation with Gleb Nosovsky about the prop version of Jerusalem Jerash next Sunday, December 27th. We look forward to seeing you in a week on the channel of the Multimedia Museum of New Chronology. Hello! Today, we are concluding our conversation with Gleb Nosovsky about the ancient city of Jerash, which in the 16th century was a prop version of the authentic Jerusalem Jerash. More details about this can be found in the new book by Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky called Phony Jerusalem. Gleb Vladimirovich, hello.
Hello. Very nice to be here.
Gleb Vladimirovich, it's clear that in the framework of our podcast, we can't go into detail about your expedition to Jerash. For that, one would need to read your new book, Phony Jerusalem. But let's return to Jerash and complete the 16th century pilgrimage that we started in our previous episode.
Let's go back to Jerash. Once again, this is Golgotha, the interior of Golgotha. Here, on the right, is the Holy Sepulchre, as I mentioned before. This is exactly how it is unequivocally described by the pilgrim. And on the left side is the place where the Lord's cross was erected. right here. We're looking at it from the other side. So, the sepulchre is on the left. When we looked from there, it was on the right. Now it's on the left. We are looking from the altar. Accordingly, this recess is on the right. It has been preserved exactly as the pilgrim described it. This recess is where the Lord's cross was erected, but the pilgrim himself did not see the actual cross. He only saw the recess. Of course, there was a layer of marble here. All of this was covered in silver. The recess was deeper than it is now. From this recess, the blood from the Lord's cross would flow and reach the abyss of hell. Here is the circular recess itself, as it looks now. You can see that it's only on one side. There are no such recesses anywhere else. We were fortunate, before we arrived there was rain. So, we were able to splash water from this recess and see where it would flow. And it did flow. It turns out there was already a ready-made groove in the floor. And as it flowed directly from this recess, the blood would run along this groove and into a hole, just as the pilgrim described. Of course, it must be understood that it didn't look exactly like this, with marble on top, and it was all very beautiful. Nevertheless, traces of how it was done are still present in this stone foundation. Here is this groove in a hole that has no depth, leading to hell. The blood from the cross would flow through this groove, reach this hole, and fall onto Adam's head. That's how it was explained to the pilgrims. This is the prison where John the Baptist was held. It is described by the pilgrim and is located on the road from Golgotha to the Church of Constantine in Helena.
Gleb Vladimirovich, please tell us a few words about the Madaba mosaic map.
This is the famous mosaic map on the floor of a church in the city of Madaba. Madaba is located near Amman, also known as Ramah. In the 20th century, a mosaic floor was discovered there, and an image of Jerusalem was found. It's a remarkable depiction. It says here that this is Jerusalem. This famous depiction of Jerusalem on the Madaba map is considered fantastic because it bears no resemblance to modern-day Jerusalem, the city known as Jerusalem today. It is considered an imaginary map. Someone just made it up and drew. However, it has a direct resemblance to Jerash. First, there's a circular square, then an alley. Do you see the columns on the left and right? This is an alley of columns, with the Church of the Resurrection right here, and in the middle of this alley, there is a tall church with 4 columns. These 4 columns have survived to this day. When you start comparing the city map, you find that it's quite unique. You can see this oval shape, intersected along its axis by an alley, lined on both sides with columns. Both to the left and to the right of it, there are some buildings. It's a unique layout for a city. Not all cities are designed this way. This is exactly how Jerash is planned. Precisely this square, then the alley, and on both sides of this alley, various sacred sites are located. In the middle of this alley stands a bell tower supported by 4 columns. Now, I'll show you these 4 columns. Here's the center of this alley, and here are these 4 columns. They have survived to this day, and a bell tower used to stand on them. Beneath this bell tower, there were also several small churches. Modern researchers don't quite understand what the churches under the bell tower are, but it becomes clear here. The 4 columns supported a structure, the bell tower, and underneath it, there was enough space for small chapels. This is all described by the pilgrim. These aren't just 4 columns. They are huge rectangular structures. One of them, and the second one, This is a modern plan. Archaeologists are puzzling over what these four columns represent. You can see the Tetrapolon Plaza, a four-columned square. Today, they speculate that there were probably statues of four emperors there. On the right is a reconstruction by modern historians. Nevertheless, the pilgrim describes everything in great detail. This is the pilgrim's path, as described in the Russian chronicler, and not only in that source. I would like to reiterate that there are many such descriptions, and they are all roughly the same because the pilgrim did not choose the path. He was led by the hand and could not deviate from the prearranged route. Therefore, they all followed the same path and left roughly the same memories. These descriptions are written in Russian, probably in Latin as well, and there are many of them. Thousands and thousands of people used to come there. So, first, the pilgrim would enter through the north gate, then ascend to Golgotha, to the Church of the Resurrection. Then he would proceed to the north to the Church of Constantine and Helena, to the Roman theater. He would descend down 30 steps and see the place where Helena recovered the true cross. Afterward, he would return to this alley, walk here, and inspect the Old Testament sites. Here, he would inspect the cemetery of Akeldama. This is the potter's field, the very place that was bought with the 30 pieces of silver that Judas threw on the ground in the temple, returning them. They said that it was the price of blood and that it couldn't be kept in the temple. If you remember, Judas sold Christ for 30 pieces of silver, then repented and threw them back. So, the Jewish high priests thought a lot about what to do with these tainted 30 pieces of silver and decided to buy a potter's field, Akeldama, to bury foreigners who were not Jerusalem residents, but strangers. This is Akeldama, field of blood, the place that was bought for 30 pieces of silver, where they bury strangers. This is the part near the south gate, and here, the Old Testament sites are described. The pilgrim describes them towards the end. Everything there was also done very skillfully. Pilgrims paid a significant amount to enter this mock Jerusalem. Orthodox monks received a substantial discount. Orthodox pilgrims were given a discount several times over. Everyone else had to pay the full price. The pilgrims walked and saw dozens of different holy sites. If someone had money left in their pocket, they had to find a way to collect that money too. I repeat once again, their route was strictly prearranged. Therefore, at the very end of their journey, there was a wonderful place, the Cave of the Annunciation. It was attached directly to the house of Joachim and Anne. This is the actual cave. It precisely matches the description. I'll tell you about it now. Behind it is the house of Joachim and Anne, but it's now a restaurant. And opposite is the pool of Bethesda, which I will also tell you about. But first, let's talk about the cave. This cave had two entrances. Here's the cave of the Nativity of the Virgin Mary. This is the south gate. I apologize. This cave did not have two entrances. It had one entrance but two windows. The Holy Spirit entered through one of these windows and exited through the other. These were different windows. You can see that they are not the same. One is round, and the other is square, to avoid confusion. I don't know which one he entered through and which one he exited through. The pilgrim doesn't write about it in such detail, but he does mention that the Holy Spirit entered through one and exited through the other. We can see that they were made slightly differently, so they probably knew which one was for entering and which one was for exiting. Since everything had already been paid for, it didn't seem right to take the money. However, there were some local residents always sitting in this cave, and the pilgrims were explained that this was private property, that people lived there, and there were owners. Therefore, you couldn't just enter here for free. If you wanted to see the place of the Annunciation, please pay more money, but not to us, to these people. And of course, if someone had anything left, they would take it out and pay a substantial amount. The sum is mentioned in the Chronicle. I can't recall it right now, but it's all described in detail there. Pilgrims paid this money, entered the cave, marveled at having been in the place of the Annunciation, and saw the windows through which the Holy Spirit entered and exited. All of this happened in the cave. Although we know from the Gospels that no cave is described in them, and no windows are mentioned in the Gospels. All of this was made up on the spot, but the pilgrim describes it exactly like this. Here is the cave. Here are the two windows, just as they are on this site. Here are these windows again. Sure, living there was impossible. I think actors sat there and collected money for the establishment.
All the money went to the Ottoman treasury, didn't it?
Certainly. On the left is the cave, and this part is on the right. There's a restaurant now, but there used to be some kind of building. This building is the house of Joachim and Anne, the parents of the Virgin Mary. For some reason, a cave was attached to the house where Saint Anne sat during the Annunciation. Apparently, that's how it was constructed. They didn't do much remodeling. They just repurposed what was already there. This is the interior of this cave, its dimensions. Of course, it's not a living space. But people allegedly lived there, I suppose, to make one pay through the nose. And this is the David's house or palace. Also, a very interesting structure. From the pilgrim's description, it's entirely unclear what kind of building it is, with huge gates instead of doors. This house doesn't have a door. It has enormous gates through which a carriage can pass. There are no living quarters in this house. It's a massive house with huge gates. The only living space there is the room of King David, from where he saw Bathsheba. This description is also puzzling. Such a huge house with gates instead of doors, with no living quarters. What kind of house is it? This was also quite cleverly done. They took an old Roman hippodrome. It's an elongated structure with gates leading into it, and according to the pilgrim, cannons lay in the gates. In reality, it was an arsenal, and janissaries stood there. There were no living quarters. Indeed, there were no living quarters in this hippodrome. There's only one room arranged as a living space. I'll show it now. It's also a bogus room. And this is the very King David's chambers. Actually, it was a non-living space. The janissaries were stationed there, as described. There was a moat around it. They didn't allow entry there. Inside, there were janissaries and cannons in this David's house. That's how it was. This is the wall of the house hippodrome. Today, it's called the hippodrome. This is how it looks. Here was an arsenal, and here were the King David's chambers. I will show it to you now. These are the gates. This is the entrance inside. These are massive gates. They were long, apparently because there was a cannon storage inside the gates. We can see that there might have been a cannon storage here. It's a long and wide passage leading into the hippodrome. And this is the King David's chambers. On the floor, they've featured some mosaic. This is the only quarters that's arranged as a residential chamber. All the other rooms are clearly non-residential and were never meant for dwelling. And probably this one was never meant to be a living space either. But they've laid the floor with mosaic and claimed that it's King David's chamber. There's only one room in the entire house, and this is what the pilgrim emphasizes. There are no other living spaces in this huge house. Everything else looks like this. Clearly, these are non-residential spaces. Perhaps, at some point, they were used when it was a hippodrome, and they kept horses there. This is the very valley through which the river of fire will flow at the end of the world. The pilgrim also describes how at the end of times, the river of fire will flow and empty into the Dead Sea. Regarding the Jordan River, what was the mistake made by those who were searching for it? It is written that the Jordan River flows into the Dead Sea, and they correctly found the Dead Sea. That same Dead Sea, the Sea of Sodom, again the pretend one. But nevertheless, the pretend Dead Sea was correctly found. The same pretend Dead Sea that exists today. The Jordan River flows into it. That's correct too. Then they moved upstream along the course of that Jordan. Here is the place of baptism they show today, at random, without knowing for sure. But it's the place they show on the Jordan River. It's the confluence of the Jordan. As we move up further, there's a point where the river splits. If you go straight north, there are two tributaries that merge here. One comes directly from the north, and the other flows from these mountains. It flows past Jerash and merges here. Two small rivers merge, forming the Jordan that flows into the Dead Sea. So, they correctly discovered the Jordan here. As they moved upstream, they had to decide which was the Jordan and which was its tributary. They decided that the Jordan was the one that flowed from the north, and they continued upstream. The other river, which today is known as Zarka or the Blue River, was considered a tributary. It flows from the mountains and passes by the imitation of Jerusalem. In reality, they made a mistake. But why did they make a mistake? Because the Zarka is the true exposition version of the Jordan River. This river is quite full here while it flows through the mountains. But when it flows out here, it becomes narrow. At the confluence with this tributary, it becomes even narrower. So, they chose the tributary that was wider and named it the Jordan. This is where they made their mistake. If they had looked more carefully and gone further up into the mountains, they would have seen that this river is much wider than this one and is the main stream. But they didn't do that. In reality, the prop version of Jerusalem is here, and somewhere around here is the old fake site of Christ's baptism. Here, the Zarka River widens and becomes deep with clear blue water. It's not the murky stream that is presented as the site of Christ's baptism today. No. Everything was very beautiful, wonderful, and impressive there. This is the Zarka River, the true exposition version of the Jordan. At this point, it's narrow and not very deep. This is not the place that served as the fake site of Christ's baptism. I don't have photos from the actual fake site of Christ's baptism. There, the river is deep with clear blue waters.
Gleb Vladimirovich, next to the prop version of Jerusalem, there was also the fake Bethlehem.
Regarding the prop version of Bethlehem, we know that there is a settlement called Bethlehem near Jerusalem. It's not Jerusalem. It's another place that is now also shown to tourists, claiming it's the very Bethlehem where Jesus Christ was born. We found the real birthplace of Jesus Christ, which is in Crimea. It's Cape Violent, a cave, where there's still the Church of the Nativity. However, since they created a fake Jerusalem, they also needed a fake Bethlehem. When we arrived there, we looked for someone for a long time. It's completely empty there. There are no tourists, no one, only local residents. Many things are fenced off, including, as indicated on the sign, the oldest church in the world. We searched for a caretaker for a while. He was extremely surprised that some tourists had come. He hadn't seen any tourists in many years. Nevertheless, since we had come, he went to open it. Here's this church, you see it? One of the oldest churches on earth is located here. The pilgrim describes the prop version of Bethlehem in great detail. He describes it as a church with a tunnel beneath it, and you can enter through this tunnel, go down, and reach a cave beneath the church, where Christ was born. This is the cave, and here is its entrance. You see, it's called the Cave Church. The pilgrim correctly counted the number of steps. We enter this cave, and the floor is quite bright, whitish in color. This is the first chamber. And this is our guide, a local boy who guided us and showed everything. This is the first chamber, and further inside, you find the second chamber. Here's the second chamber. There's something like an altar. It's evident that candles were burned here, and the ceiling is blackened. Some paper cups are lying around. I don't know why the local residents keep them. Maybe they use them for drinking. I don't know. A hole was made in the ceiling. The pilgrim also describes this, and it's still there, allowing light to enter. This is the hole in the ceiling. The hole can be seen from the outside. And here is a view of this church from above. They covered it and restore remnants of the mosaic, the altar, but all of this is modern reconstruction. Nonetheless, there are some old stones below, and above is the restoration work. And these are the remains of Christian churches next to the mosque. The mosque itself is also built on the site of a Christian church. They recently started excavating them, and by chance, after a recent rain, mosaics were revealed. These are the mosaics still present in large quantities. These are Christian mosaics. Part of them has been relaid. Muslims are prohibited from depicting living creatures. There was a bird, and they slightly distorted it to avoid resemblance. They have a legend that the city of Rahab is the birthplace of a certain Imam, Abdullah bin Amr al-Shami al-Yasobi, one of the 7 Quranic reciters. In a nutshell, some wonderful person. But I think they've probably forgotten everything, but they still remember that this city is the birthplace of some famous person. Well, they found a candidate for that fame. But, as we understand now, in reality, this is the birthplace of Christ. They just forgot about it and chose someone else, but they still remember that this city is the birthplace of some famous person. This is another Christian church. You see, there are swastikas, right by the walls of the mosque. Further, the mosque begins. They don't destroy it, don't dig underneath, but it also stands on the site of a Christian church. And they know that. You see, church complex, Rahab. There are many churches in this complex. The caretaker told us, they've excavated 22, but there are many more yet to be excavated. We returned to Jerash once more. There's an amazing place, the Church of the Propylaea, and in this church, a mosaic floor with a date was found. This mosaic is no longer there. We never managed to figure out where it is. They've hidden it somewhere. However, we've seen a photograph of it displayed in Jerash, but it's not in any book. But in Jerash itself, on a museum plaque, there's a picture of it, and nowhere else. It's not very clear here, but you can see that there's a date. Here it is, the date. E is yetus, which in Greek means year. E stands for year. And here, you see the date, and the little cross is the start of the inscription. They managed to read this date as 627. They somehow managed to read this letter as he. They must have really tried hard. However, they correctly read the 27. I'll show it enlarged now. They read 27 correctly. Kappa is 20, and this is 7. But one had to really try hard to read this letter as 600. They decided that it was the letter he. Nevertheless, it's perfectly obvious that this is the letter zeta, representing 7, and the tail goes below the line. So, the date is 7027. That's the year 1519. It's precisely after Sultan Selim I's conquest in 1515. The Ottomans conquered these areas in 1515. Here, this date, 1519, indicates when they turned this place into a mock Jerusalem. Well, give or take a year. It might not be the exact first year, but it's one of the earliest years when they did this. That's it in a nutshell. But, of course, I can't tell you everything. It's a whole book, and one needs to read it. I find it very interesting. It clarifies many things, answers numerous questions, and puts a lot of pieces in their place. Why was Jerusalem found where it was found? On what basis? How could they make such a significant error? We know that Jerusalem is on the Bosphorus. So, why did they find it there? Indeed, there are descriptions, accounts of pilgrimages, and the famous miracle of the holy fire. There is a lot of information. All of this should have its historical roots somewhere. Somehow this had to be explained. Until recently, we had no explanation. Yes, there were peculiarities. We understood that holy sites from completely different times, and even from the same time, but still describing real history, can't be located just steps away from each other, huddled together in a small area. But that's how pilgrims describe them. It's challenging to argue with what's been written. However, it creates a sense of oddity and confusion. Nevertheless, that's how it's written. It's not written by just one person. It's written by many. Therefore, the question remained, something was unclear. However, these questions were answered thanks to the Russian chronicler and this detailed description. Furthermore, it was written in a way that made everything visible. If a person knows Church Slavonic, understands Old Russian well, they could see the subtle inaccuracy. A numeral was omitted. Formally, one could skip a numeral. This was a very slight hint that something might not be right there. However, upon closer examination, it stood out, especially if you read not in modern script but in the old one. Some skill in reading old texts showed that something wasn't right. Most likely, a numeral was omitted. This assumption led to rich results. The long text had many different numbers, many different dates. You can't check everything, right or wrong, it's too vast. But it was clear what should not be trusted, what was most likely incorrect. Everything else was correct. This was an old mistake, an error in the number of days from Jaffa to Ramah. It had been made a long time ago and apparently it got confusing. Somewhere, 1 day was put instead of 4. We know that there should have been 4 days, not 1. It was because of the Greek letters alpha and delta. Alpha means 1, and delta means 4. Before, they looked very similar. Confusing 1 and 4 is a typical mistake in old Greek manuscripts. Naturally, there was a suspicion that there might not be 1, but 4. This was often confused. And everything immediately fell into place.
Gleb Vladimirovich, thank you very much for the interesting story.
You're welcome.